One of the more iconic images originating from the Wild West period of United States history is that of the wagon trains crawling across open plains, dry deserts, and rugged mountainsides. Wagon trains were important parts to the European exploration of America, specifically the real-world implementation of manifest destiny and the desire of settlers to move westward, itching to see what had mostly been unexplored by previous European conquests. Of course, the settlers and their wagon trains weren't the only human caravans operating across the American West. Surrounding the wagons in all corners of all trails connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific were indigenous tribes who had called the American frontier their home for millennia. To the tribes, the wagon trains were deliberate encroachments on their land, often against the wishes of opposing indigenous communities. Even with treaties in place between the indigenous and the colonists, bands of Native Americans did not approve of the excess migration and felt the settlers were either disrespectful to their homeland or outright violent. Thus, violence was a regular mark laid upon wagon trains and their misadventures along various trails in the West. Trains were raided and numerous folks were slain, as conflicts between the indigenous and who they believed were invaders truly boiled over into the mid-19th century. Here's the story of 3 wagon train raids and massacres that reflect the inherent violence of the Wild West and the disconnect between white settlers and Native Americans during the height of manifest destiny. In May of 1871, a contractor by the name of Henry Warren was dispatched by the United States government to deliver foodstuffs and other supplies to various military forts across the western vistas of Texas. These forts included Fort Richardson, Fort Griffin, and Fort Concho. Warren and his team of 12 freighters traveled via the Jacksboro-Belknap Road, a direct route landing them at each destination in the shortest and safest amount of time. They departed with 10 mule-led wagons filled to the brim with corn and fodder feed for the livestock. At the same time, about 150 indigenous warriors of a Kiowa tribe and a few from a Comanche tribe were descending south from the Fort Sill Reservation in present-day Oklahoma. The band of warriors were led by famous orator and war chief Satanta, medicine man and experienced fighter Satank, and noted chief Adoit, all of the Kiowa tribe. They were looking to secure safety across the Red River of Texas and return to another reservation. However, they also saw the opportunity to strike back against the U.S. government for the encroachment during the long-gestating Texas-American Indian Wars. Thus, in the same May of 1871, the band of Kiowa and Comanche camouflaged themselves within the brush and watched as General William T. Sherman of the U.S. Army lead an inspection force of 18 men throughout West Texas. They don't attack the retinue at this point, though, as a shaman by the name of Momanti had predicted the night before that a large crew with more supplies to raid would become available soon after. The shaman's prophecy came true when on May 18, 1871, Henry Warren's wagon train ran into General Sherman's crew along the Jacksboro-Belknap Road. Not even 60 minutes later, just before Salt Creek Crossing, Satanta and his 150 warriors surprised the Warren party and plundered their supplies. During the raid, 3 Kiowa warriors were killed and 7 of Warren's 12 men were slain, and all of the supplies and livestock were taken from the wagon train. The 5 teamsters who did manage to escape were led by Thomas Brazil, and were able to venture all 20 miles to Fort Richardson on foot. There, they reunited with General Sherman, who learned of the Warren wagon train raid and sent Colonel Ranald S. McKenzie to arrest the Kiowa war chiefs. Back at Salt Creek Crossing, instead of crossing the Red River, Satanta and company reverted back to Fort Sills to claim additional rations. And instead of going in quietly, however, they discussed the raid with an indigenous government agent named Laurie Tatum. Tatum then alerted General Sherman of the warrior band's arrival, and the 3 chiefs, Satanta, Satank, and Adoit, were all arrested. They were sent to Fort Richardson to stand trial, but only 2 of the 3 Kiowa warriors made it alive, as Satank was killed after attempting to flee the U.S. Army transportation train. Initially, Satanta and Adoit were sentenced to death, but eventually these sentences were reduced to life in prison by the then Texas Governor Edmund Davis. It was only an additional 2 years before the war chiefs were released from prison after Kiowa Principal Chief Guipago successfully negotiated on their behalf. In the end, Satanta returned to the battlefield to fight for his tribe's sovereignty and to retaliate against the elimination of the American buffalo. Adowit took a quieter approach when returning home, but both men ended up back in prison before the end of the 1870s. In the summer of 1864, two families residing in eastern Kansas, called the Kelly and Larimer families, packed up most of what they owned in 4 wagons after deciding to pursue their dreams of a new life out west. The Kelly party consisted of husband and wife Josiah and Fanny Kelly, their 7-year-old adopted daughter Mary, a couple of hired assistants and father and son duo Andy and Franklin Sullivan, 2 African-American men who had recently been freed as slaves by a small band of Cherokee Native Americans, and a single straggler by the name of Gardner Wakefield. Along with the Kelly party came the Larimer party, including husband and wife William and Sarah Larimer, their 8-year-old son Frank, and their specially hired wagon driver Noah Daniel Taylor. The Kelly family had long gestated plans to open up a general store, or maybe a hotel, for a couple of mining companies starting up in the Montana Territory in 2 cities called Virginia City and Bannock. Thus, their wagons were chock full of 1.5 tons of flour, a half-ton of coffee, a half-ton of dried fruit, 45 gallons of liquor, and other various dried goods and clothing. In addition, the Kellys brought with them 25 calves and 50 dairy cows to complete their future dairy ranch. The Larimer family had different aspirations. Sarah was a somewhat successful commercial photographer in her own right, and had acquired a bevy of photographic equipment, including cameras and lighting tech available at the time. The Larimers had plans to open up a photography studio at the same mining camps, in an effort to capture the endeavors of folks starting new lives across the western frontier. To kick off their joint ventures, the Kelly-Larimer party set out on the Oregon Trail. Not long after, they met up with a single wagon train driven by the nearly blind Reverend Andrew Sharp, an old Methodist pastor who looked to bring his Christian teachings to the Old West. Reverend Sharp felt endeared by the two families and joined them on their journey. After entering what is present-day Wyoming, the Kelly-Larimer party turned north along the Oregon Trail that broke off through southern Wyoming territory. It was around this time, when the train moved about 120 miles northwest of Fort Laramie, Wyoming, that trouble started brewing across the horizon. At this time, there had been little communication between the United States government and the existing indigenous tribes calling the Wyoming Territory their home for generations. The indigenous people were incensed that white settlers had started using their routes for homesteading, and without a binding treaty or lawful understanding, it left the smaller wagon trains prone to conflict. In July of 1864, a band of Oglala Native Americans, a subset of the Lakota tribes, heard of white pioneers cascading across what they referred to as the Holy Road, and wanted to get a better look for themselves. At first, the meeting was decided to be one of peace and fellowship. The Sioux and all of their tribes believed in the fostering of kinship with all living things, and simply wanted to eat and smoke with the white travelers. Thus, in that same July, the band of Oglala encountered the Kelly-Larimer party at their campsite near Little Box Elder Creek. There, they were joined by a few other bands of other Sioux tribes, and their numbers are said to have ranged from 80 to 100, but still they arrived in peace. The Kelly-Larimer party happily obliged, providing their indigenous acquaintances with sugar, bread, and most importantly, tobacco. When the tribesmen left, only to return a second time with continued friendly relations, the wagon train cooked supper for all 100-plus people. Up until this point, the positive connections between the indigenous peoples and the Kelly-Larimer party were well documented. The Larimers' wagon driver, Noah Taylor, had actually written home only a week prior, stating that they felt no threat or violence was imminent from the surrounding tribes. Unfortunately, the pleasantries ended later that night of the feast. After the Oglala tribesmen left the Little Box Elder Creek camp, a Sioux messenger intercepted the band and informed them of an indigenous massacre along the Missouri River, where U.S. soldiers had beheaded some of the Oglala's relatives and placed their skulls at the ends of poles. The warrior members of the tribe were fueled with rage and voted to declare vengeance on their slain brothers and sisters. Back at the wagon train camp, the Kelly and Larimer families were unaware of the happenings at the Missouri River and continued gathering wood for their fires and preparing for next day's meals. That is until they were beset with an array of gunfire and arrowheads. Much to their surprise, the Oglala had returned with revenge, swiftly killing Franklin Sullivan, Reverend Sharp, and Noah Taylor before they could escape. The rest of the wagon train parties fled as quickly as they could, Josiah Kelly camouflaged himself in some nearby brush and evaded capture whilst the rest of his family turned around in the other direction. Up ahead, another wagon appeared over the hill after following the Kelly-Larimer party only behind a day's time. Their scout leader and outrider was also killed by the Oglala tribesmen, and the wayfaring wagon turned around as quickly as it had arrived. Back at the campsite, the Oglala raided what was left of the wagons. They emptied the sacks of flour across the ground and packed as much food as they could on their horses. The rest of the belongings were trampled or burned, and 4 members of the party were ultimately captured, including Fanny Kelly, her daughter Mary, Sarah Larimer, and her son Frank. The most unsettling aspect of the raid was the fate of little Mary Kelly. She escaped capture with her mother, Fanny, but was separated after Fanny was kidnapped once more by the Oglala warriors. For a few days, Mary wandered along the creek bed. There was a point where 3 U.S. soldiers spotted her through the bush, but figured she was being used as bait for an ambush. They decided to encircle her position over the course of a night, but by dawn had lost all traces of the young girl. Unfortunately, the next day, her body was found scalped and pierced with arrows by a separate group of settlers making their way through Powder River country. Elsewhere, Sarah and her son Frank managed to flee from captivity after only 2 days. They were aided by a peaceful Oglala tribesman who had felt the pair were being held unfairly. They were able to make it as far as the trading post in Deer Creek and were reunited with William. Fanny Kelly, however, wasn't as fortunate. She remained with the band of Oglala tribesmen that initially kidnapped her for 5 months, unable to be rescued by her surviving husband, Josiah. Josiah had dispatched a separate group of Native Americans to find her, but they never could pinpoint her exact location. Fanny was eventually freed in the winter of 1865, when a band of Blackfoot Sioux were looking to establish their own peace talks with the Oglala band in Wyoming Territory. The U.S. Army took Fanny back into their custody at Fort Sully along the Missouri River, after Sitting Bull realized the continuance of her captivity could spark greater conflict. In February 1895, Fanny was reunited with Josiah Kelly, and the two opened up a hotel in Ellsworth, Kansas before Josiah died of disease 2.5 years later in July of 1867. Kelly was 8 months pregnant at the time and needed a stable income. Thus, she moved to Sherman Station along the Union Pacific Railroad in Wyoming, where Sarah Larimer was operating her photography studio. Together, the woman decided to write about their trials and tribulations whilst under detainment of the Oglala. Unfortunately, their relationship was frayed after Sarah stole Fanny's personal manuscript and published it under her own name, resulting in a court case and private settlement. Nevertheless, their maligned attempt to migrate westward and join the miners of Montana Territory was never forgotten and is now a vital story within Wyoming lore. The origins of the Utter Party Massacre, also called the Van Ornum Party Massacre or Myers Massacre, began in the southern region of Wisconsin in May of 1860. It was around this time the Van Ornum Party set out for Oregon Territory, specifically the Willamette Valley in the northwest region of the country. About a month later, on June 5, 1860, the Van Ornum Party connected with the Utter Party in Omaha, Nebraska. Together, the parties featured 18 men, 5 women, over 20 children, 12 entire wagons, and enough livestock to reach triple-digit numbers. Targeting a rendezvous in Oregon, it only made sense for the newly formed Utter Van Ornum Party to head west together on the Oregon Trail. They made it as far as Fort Hall, Idaho, without as much as a hint of trouble, taking shelter in the mostly abandoned former military base. On August 21st, after a 2.5-month journey, the party of 34 quickly became a party of 40, after a deserter from the army and 5 other discharged vets teamed up with the two factions. They camped for a couple of days to chart the rest of their journey and left camp on August 29th. Before leaving Fort Hall, the party acquired the protective services of a small company of Army soldiers. The security detail numbered 22 men, but after 6 days, the leader of the Dragoons grew tired with some of the Utter Van Ornum Party members and ventured back to Fort Hills from Twin Falls, Idaho. Nevertheless, the wagon train pushed forward, and on September 8th, they made it to Castle Creek, Idaho, only a few kilometers from the Oregon border. At this point, another 4 stragglers attached themselves to the wagon train. However, the caravan had lost at least 4 wagons as they rolled into Castle Creek with 8. The losses didn't stop there either. Later that night, after the train members went to sleep, a small band of Native Americans snuck up on the parties and stole a few animals in the livestock brigade. When the Utters and Van Ornums woke up, they immediately knew someone had stolen their animals, but had no choice but to press on. That same day, the wagon train was surrounded by an Indigenous band who tried to stampede the livestock. The Utter Van Ornum party quickly formed the now iconic defensive circle around their cattle and actually engaged in peaceful trade talks with the Indigenous counterparts. With a few minutes of bartering, the wagon train was left unharmed after trading away food items and other odds and ends for peace, and the Utter Van Ornum party continued traveling northwest. Unfortunately, they didn't make it far. After just one more mile of excursion, another band of Native Americans, either from the Shoshone or Bannock tribes, attacked the wagon train, killing Lewis Lawson of the Van Ornum party and two of the Army veterans, named William Utley and Charles Kisnell. Still undeterred, however, the parties kept on. On September 10th, another attack was mounted on the wagon train, and Judson Cressy of the Van Ornums was slain. This time, the rest of the parties knew that they had to change their game plan, and moved forward only after leaving behind the rest of their livestock and 4 of the wagons to distract the Native Americans. While it brought the wagon train a sliver of time, the distraction did little to mitigate the attacks. Another round of defense by the Indigenous tribes saw another colonist by the name of John Myers die, as well as Elijah Utter when the rest of the surviving party members fled on foot. Abigail Utter, Elijah's wife, refused to leave her husband's side, as did their 4 children, and their family of 6 never made it across the Idaho-Oregon border. In an attempt to gain control of the chaos, 2 brothers of the wagon train survivors, Jacob and Joseph Reith, fled the scene with the remaining soldiers, named Private Theodore Murdoch, Private Henry Snyder, and Sergeant Charles Schamberg. They were joined by the deserter, Charles Chaffee, and all of the men escaped with plenty of weapons, ammunition, and their horses. It wasn't long before they suffered losses too, though, as Teddy Murdoch and Charles Schamberg were killed by the land's defenders. Meanwhile, the rest of the caravan, consisting of 27 colonists, used the nearby Snake River to camouflage themselves. With only a bit of food rations and a few weapons left from the abandoned wagon, their outlook turned sour rather quickly. Eventually, the 27 party members came to an agreement that rather than remain sitting ducks, they would attempt to march forward on foot. As they left, they saw the remains of the wagon train burning in the distance, and they decided not to look back. Of course, it was nearly impossible with the anxiety of another ambush lurking around every corner. To evade capture, the party would sleep in the shrubs during the day and then walk at night until the Native Americans stopped following them. By September 17, 1860, 2 of the members named Goodsell Munson and Christopher Trimble left to seek help, while the remaining 25 found a dying cow and ate it out of desperation. Another 5 days later, and on September 22nd, Munson and Trimble caught up with the surviving Army veterans and the deserter. The men decided it was best to kill one of their horses for food, and Trimble was tasked with bringing it back to the Utter Van Ornum party. By the time Trimble made it back to the original caravan, however, the remaining colonists were engaged with trade talks with a band of Shoshone tribal members. While it seemed peaceful at first, the Indigenous did not trust the white settlers with their guns and forcefully removed them. Thinking quickly on his feet, Trimble decided he would leave with the Shoshone in an attempt to secure more food for his family and the others. He offered himself as a hostage, but was never heard from again, and his remains were recovered about a month later on October 24th. Between them, the rest of the party members slowly died off from numerous causes. Some of the survivors had split off to find a rescue party, but they were eventually killed by scalping, lethal arrow shots, and slit throats by the Indigenous tribes. At the same time, 3 of the Van Ornum daughters were taken captive, as well as their brother Reuben. The girls were found starved to death the next year in 1861, but Reuben Van Ornum was found alive. In November of 1862, the Shoshone told Reuben's rescuers of the California Army Volunteer Brigade that the boy was in fact not Reuben, but rather the son of another chief's sister-in-law, but the California Army Volunteer Brigade didn't buy it. While his identity was never confirmed, Reuben ended up leaving his uncle's house in Oregon 8 years later in 1870, due to being unable to return to pioneer life, and he decided to be adopted back into the Shoshone tribe that had originally captured him. Jacob and Joseph Reith were able to make it to the Umatilla Agency in Oregon, and directed a search and rescue faction down to the Burnt River, where the surviving Army vet Munson and the deserter Chafee were inches away from death due to extreme hunger. The remaining survivors, who were neither dead nor captured, set up a camp along the Owyhee River and saw 4 people die in the span of a week from starvation. The others didn't want to meet the same fate and had to resort to cannibalism to survive, eventually eating the deceased children. In the end, 10 people were found alive at the starvation camp, rescued after 45 days spent without resources. They were discovered on October 24, 1860, by Captain Frederick T. Dent of Fort Walla Walla's Army Relief Expedition Forces. The Utter Van Ornum Party Massacre was the deadliest wagon train raid in the history of the Oregon Trail and Washington territories, and a symbol of the consequences settlers encountered in their search for manifest destiny.